Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our Then, Now, and How podcast, where we discuss this Come Follow Me scripture block for the week. This week, we are going to be discussing Book of Mormon, Alma, chapters 53 to 63. So a big old chunk. And I'm Stephanie Dibb Sorensen. I'm here with my good friends, Heather B. Moore and Michelle Wilson. For us, this is kind of exciting because even though you guys watch and listen to the show every week, we kind of recorded a bunch ahead of time because of summer travel and things like that. So this is our first time back together in several weeks. So we're getting all reacquainted and it's fun to be here. All right.
I feel like
so
we need to record a pre-show just so that we can hear what that sounds like.
We got all caught up about, all of our health, our families. We're good. Okay. So today, as I said, we're going to discuss these. It's technically 11 chapters, right? If we count them up on our fingers, unless I'm doing bad math quick, but lots of stuff happening. So I think that Heather is going to carry the big brunt here of just giving us context, setting, plot, like what is happening in these chapters and how are things unfolding. So we will start with Heather, who is our queen then. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. So there is a lot in these chapters. I'm going to give you the Cliff Notes or the Heather Notes, I suppose we could call them. But as you know, we are in 64 to 63 BC. And I love the next few episodes we're doing because I feel like every chapter we're just getting a little closer to Christ. And so that's why I kind of focus, because there's so many wars and so many contentions. And sometimes we think when we're doing what's right or making a right choice, it's like things, just chaos happens around us, but we know we're getting closer to Christ and making those choices. So just kind of catch up from our last couple of episodes is we know there's contention in the government and some of the people in Zarahemla want a king, and Amalickiah comes with the Lamanites to battle, and Teancum slayed Amalickiah. Jacob the Zoramite is slain, and the Lamanites who won't surrender are taken prisoner. So that's kind of catching up. And now we're in Alma 53, where the Lamanite prisoners are used to fortify the city of Bountiful. Moroni also makes efforts to fortify the city of Mulek, which he obtained from the Lamanites in battle. But this is not stopping the Lamanites. They're still encroaching on Nephite territory. But good news is that the people of Ammon, they are keeping their oath to not take up arms, even though they see all the destruction. But interestingly enough, in verses 10, basically verses 10 through 15, you kind of see them really struggling and wanting to go and fight because they can't stand all this destruction happening around them. But Helaman tells them to not break their oath or they might lose their souls. And so they decide that that they're not going to, but this also kind of allows the sons to then say, we will take up arms because we have not made that oath. And by then, they're calling themselves the Nephites. And in verse 17, it says they enter into a covenant to fight for the liberty of the Nephites. And we know the story very well that the 2,000 young men who eventually are called stripling warriors, and they ask Helaman to be their leader. And so they're also called the sons of Helaman. I love verse 21 where it says that these young men are men of truth and soberness, for they had been taught to keep the commandments of God and walk uprightly before him. So they know what they're doing, they know what they're getting themselves into, and they're willing to fight for their freedom. And so in Alma 54, we're still in 63 BC, and Amram, who is the Lamanite king, wants to exchange prisoners. So if you can imagine, both sides, Nephites and Lamanites, they both have prisoner war in their different cities and camps. And so he reaches out to Moroni. And Moroni is at first very excited because not only did the Lamanites capture men, but they also captured women and children. And so he writes back to Amram and says he wants to exchange a man, his wife, and children in exchange for one Lamanite. And if Amram does not agree to that, then Moroni will start the next battle, and he will also arm his women and children. And in verse 12, it says that he will fight blood for blood until you are destroyed from the face of the earth. So I feel like Moroni's kind of hit that limit.
He's not going to negotiate with a terrorist.
Yeah. He hit his, so he's at his limit now. So he's kind of throwing down the gauntlet a little bit. Oh, a lot. So of course Amram is angry, and he writes back and he says he's going to avenge his brother Malachiah's death, who was killed previously. And he also brings up the original wrongdoing. Have you ever been in an argument where the argument starts out for something that's happening that day, but all of a sudden you're arguing about something that happened 10 years ago? So
no, I have never done that.
Never done that.
Digging
Well,
up
Just ask my husband. I have never done that.
but I know it's not, I know this is very serious and very tragic, all these wars, but I just thought it sounded like the little brother, neener, kind of like, remember when your fathers wronged our fathers. We're talking about Lehi dying and then Nephi becoming, basically the next prophet, and then Laman and Lemuel starting all these wars. And so
literally 440 years ago.
yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, which nobody even knew
Or
any of those people.
540.
Yeah. So it's like your 8th great grandparents that you're arguing about. Or I don't know however long they lived, your 16th great grandparents. So then something happens where okay, so then Amram says, we will grant the exchange of prisoners according to your request in order to preserve our food. So we're tired of feeding all your men, all their wives, and all their children, but we're going to still be fighting. So we're going to give you back your prisoners, but we're going to come at you. And then Amram also says that Moroni, the other thing I want to say is that Amram is an original descendant of Zoram. If you remember Zoram, and he also is claiming that Zoram was tricked into leaving Jerusalem after Nephi killed Laban. So that's the first I ever heard that there was a trick. So obviously that story has changed over the years. And now we're in Alma 55, and we advance 40 years. So we're 63 to 62 BC. Moroni, of course, is angry at Amram's epistle. And this kind of reminds me of back in the day when people were started using emails. And you don't realize emails, you miss a lot of the connotation or maybe the way the person is saying something, and you might get up in arms. And so you write back furiously with an angry reply when the person was actually being polite. So there's a lot of probably things lost in translation with this type of negotiation. And so Moroni becomes angry and he says, okay, we're not exchanging prisoners. And so he has to come up with a new plan. So he finds someone among the Nephites that is a Lamanite descent. So this is kind of interesting because it tells me that there's maybe some physical differences between Lamanites and Nephites. So if someone, you can say, oh, they look like they're Lamanite or they are Lamanite. So he finds someone of Lamanite descent. And this actually is a little funny. He sends a Lamanite man, or the Lamanite looking man, and a few of his friends, and they bring some wine, and they go into Amram's territory, and they get everyone drunk. And then these men all return, and they tell Moroni, okay, they're drunk. And so then a whole bunch of other men creep into so it's the city of Gib. They creep in the city of Gib. They give all the weapons. They give weapons to all the prisoners. And so when the Lamanites wake up, they're surrounded by the Nephi army, and their prisoners are armed.
And they have a hangover.
Yeah. And so Moroni then takes the Lamanites in the city of Gib. He takes them as prisoner of war. And then they use those same prisoners to now strengthen and rebuild Gid. And then the Lamanites try to play a trick on them, and they come at them with some offers of wine. But the Nephites are smart. They say, nope, we already know the wine trick. We've done it a few times, and we're not going to drink your wine.
I thought it was funny that they would feed the wine to their war prisoners first to make sure if it was good or not. Right?
Yeah.
Sure,
and again, not that any of this is funny, but I just love how it says, well, if it's going to kill a Nephite, it's going to kill a Lamanite. So
yeah, I think you can have your wine. Anyway, so chapter Alma 56. So we're 6. So this is actually jumps around. You can just look at the little epigraph at the beginning of the chapters. It tells you which verses are actually in what years. But basically, this chapter is when the 2,000 sons of Helaman, which is the stripling warriors, which they're former people of Ammon, Moroni is receiving battle reports and how they're in all these battles, but none of them have been killed. So this is kind of miraculous, thinking that this group of young men have been protected. And then Alma 57, which is 63 BC, battles continue. Alma 58, battles continue some more, but Nephites are now gaining the upper hand. And the stripling warriors continue to be protected. And then in Alma 59, so we're now 62 BC, and it's the 30th reign of the judges. And this is when the city of Nephi is lost. And Moroni is not getting support from the government. So obviously his resources are getting depleted, and help and food supplies are not coming in from Paharan, who is the chief judge. And so in Alma 60, he sends probably another epistle, one of his ones that threaten to attack the government if he is not sent help. And so you can just kind of see how many years we've been in this war. And now Nephi is like, why am I fighting if my own government is not going to help us? But unbeknownst to Moroni, in Alma 61, we learn that Paharan is dealing with an insurrection against the government. And the kingmen have taken Zarahemla, and the kingmen are also in league or cahoots with the Lamanites. And so Paharan is forced to flee, and he ends up in the land of Gideon. And the kingmen, meanwhile, in Zarahemla, they appoint a king, and they also are creating an alliance with the Lamanites. So in Alma 62, Moroni finds this out. So he knows what's really going on. He doesn't try to threaten Paharan anymore, and he actually marches to defend Paharan. And I love like this whole chapter where, well, the beginning of the chapter, where you can imagine Moroni marching to defend his chief judge, and he's raising the standard of liberty wherever he goes, and people are joining him on the march to go and liberate Paharan and protect him. And then they fetch Paharan and they march on Zarahemla to take their city back. So Pachus is slain. He was kind of the interim king, and then Paharan is now restored to his judgment seat. And there's more battles, and they're able to drive the Lamanites not completely away, but as far away as they can. And Helaman then kind of starts to decide, well, Helaman decides he wants to now focus on building up the church. So he feels like things are stable as far as the war is going on, and he wants to restore kind of the things that have been neglected lately. So the last chapter, Alma 63, we're now 56 to 52 BC. Shiblon takes over the sacred things that Helaman had inherited from Alma. Moroni dies. People start leaving the Zarahemla area. It says 5,400 men plus their families sail northward. And then Shiblon dies. Corianton takes off and goes north. And Helaman, the next Helaman, so I just call him Helaman Jr., he gets the plates. And there's a small battle where a Lamanite army goes against the people of Moroni, and the Lamanites are then defeated. So that's really the summary of it all. And I will turn it over to Stephanie.
Awesome. I just watched today the Book of Mormon videos of these chapters, and I thought it was really cool. First of all, I really like how they portrayed Captain Moroni. He was pretty strong. And then and then also I guess, even though, you know how you like have read or looked at the story so many times and a little thing will stand out to you because you look at it differently. So when I was watching the video, and you just said this in your summary, and I probably have known this before, but I never paid attention before to the fact that I always knew that the stripling warriors, they joined because their parents didn't want to break their covenant. But it was when I was watching the video that it dawned on me, or that I at least paid attention to, the fact that they entered into a new covenant. Like they made their own covenant. It wasn't just like, oh, okay, you can't do this because you don't have a covenant, so I will do it. Mm-hmm. Fine, let's go. But they declared that they would, as a covenant people, enter into these battles to defend their families and to fight for the cause of Christ. And I thought that was really cool, because it showed that they were following their parents' example of covenant making. And then as we see the story play out, they're also following their parents' example of covenant keeping. So I thought that was cool. So, okay. Speaking of the stripling warriors, I just wanted to give our listeners 2 talks that they can go read that I thought had really cool insights about the stripling warriors and what their example means in this day. One of them was by Brother Michael T. Nelson in April 2024. So just the most recent General Conference. He is the second counselor in the Young Men's General Presidency, and he gave a talk called In Support of the Rising Generation. And he really focused on how the adults can help the younger generation of the church. And he used the backdrop of the story of the stripling warriors as an example for that. And then also Elder M. Russell Ballard, all the way back in October 2002, gave a talk called The Greatest Generation of Missionaries. And he talked about how we can prepare the younger generation for their missionary service and for the things that we're having them do. And again, he compared most of his talk against the backdrop of the story of Helaman and his 2,000 sons. So those are just some resources to enhance your Come Follow Me study this week. And then I just want to focus on one concept that jumped out to me from the reading, and that shows up in chapter 56 in verse 15. And this is part of the epistle that Helaman sent to Moroni, where he's describing to him how everything went with the battles and with his 2,000 sons. And in verse 15, it says, "And these are the cities which they possessed when I arrived at the city of Judea, and I found Antipas and his men toiling with their might to fortify the city. Yea, and they were depressed in body as well as in spirit, for they had fought valiantly by day and toiled by night to maintain their cities. And thus they had suffered great afflictions of every kind." Now, I'm going to come back to this and read this a little bit more, but I just think it's really interesting in his report that he says, we showed up to Antipas where his people had been fighting, and they were struggling. Like they were in a bad place when we showed up. In verse 17, and now they were determined to conquer in this place or die. Therefore, you may well suppose that this little force which I brought with me, yea, those sons of mine, gave them great hopes and much joy. And I just thought that was really cool, because again, when I watched the video today, those little 2,000 stripling warriors, maybe it's because I'm getting older and older, but they looked young. Like these were young boys, right? And here he shows up with his little, which he describes, my little band or whatever, showed up. But they brought so much joy and relief to Antipas and his people, who were just battle weary. They were tired. They've been fighting, but it's hard. They've suffered a lot. And then if we jump all the way to verse 49 and 50, later we have the story about how their army, Helaman and his army, ran ahead and the Lamanites pursued them, and then Antipas and the army followed behind. Maybe I'm getting this wrong, but one of them was chasing the other one, and it ended up that the Lamanites turned and battled with Antipas and his people. And then we see in verse 49, it says, "And it came to pass that I did return with my 2,000 against these Lamanites who had pursued us. And now behold, the armies of Antipas had overtaken them, and a terrible battle had commenced. The army of Antipas," this is now verse 50, "being weary because of their long march in so short a space of time, were about to fall into the hands of the Lamanites. And had I not returned with my 2,000, they would have obtained their purpose." And so I just thought, this was kind of a cool concept, this analogy about showing up to encourage and help those who are struggling and weary, and how Helaman and his army of 2,000 did this at least twice for Antipas, right? And his army, and how much it helped them in a hard time to have these reinforcements show up. And I just think, like, in our own daily lives and in our circle of influence, in our families and in our neighborhoods and in our wards, are we aware of people who are battle weary? Like maybe they've been doing hard things for a long time and they're tired and they're determined to do the right thing, but they're weary. They're maybe discouraged, right? And in what ways can we show up and bring them joy and encouragement and reinforcements and strengthen them in what they're doing. And we see also in between those two stories in verse 27, we have the stories about how the fathers of the stripling warriors showed up with provisions. So then it was, they were serving and they were being served. And to me, that just kind of felt like that's what a Zion community does, right? Like we reinforce and strengthen those in Doctrine and Covenant, that verse about lifting the hands that hang down and things. And I think that that's what we see happening here. So I just went and looked. I thought, well, what are the prophets and apostles teaching about this concept, about showing up to help people who are feeling discouraged? And I was able to find a few thoughts. Before I start sharing those, do either of you have any comments about the story itself and what we're seeing here?
Yeah, first of all, I don't know how it has escaped me for all these years, but you pointing that out, that's the first time that I noticed that it was the fathers of those little band of warriors that brought them their food. Now, how hard would that have been for those dads to show up and to see their sons and to see them in this position? And I think it's just amazing, these young men who have never seen battle, their first mission, air quotes, their first mission is to be a decoy basically and to run away and have the Lamanites chase them for 3 days, not knowing. I mean, they barely slept and they were being chased after. And what's so significant about them coming to help, and I don't know if you're going to get there, so I apologize if I'm
Nope, you're good.
going ahead of you. But in verses like 44 and 45, 46, they had this decision to make. All of a sudden, after 3 days of running from bloodthirsty Lamanite men that want to kill these boys, they're not being chased anymore. And here they had the decision. Do we stay?
Yep.
Do we keep going forward where it's safe? Or do we turn around?
And
And
help.
they made that, yes, and help. And they made that decision to go into a place feeling fear. You cannot tell me that they weren't afraid. Right. And I think
And
sometimes,
tired.
yeah. And sometimes we're like, I don't want to reach out to that sister that I've been asked to minister to, because what if she doesn't like me? What if she doesn't want to be a friend? Just because we're afraid to do something good doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. And so I just love that example that they said, that they made that decision to go to a place where it's uncomfortable, using that term very loosely, because a battle ensued. Their very first bloody battle ensued.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. That's an excellent point too. That was a choice that they made. They didn't have to go back and help. They were finally in the clear, so to speak. Right. And Helaman gave them that option. My sons, what do you want to do? And they were like, let's go get them. Let's go help Antipas. And they did. So here are some thoughts. I'm really focusing on my assignment, which is the now. And that is like, what does this mean for us today? And it wouldn't surprise you if we talk about like running to the rescue of people. Any particular prophet come to mind? How about Thomas S. Monson?
Yeah.
Right. And so in 1999, Thomas S. Monson, this is just one of thousands of examples, but this is something that he taught in a talk called October 99 Priesthood Power. He said, there are many out there who plead and pray for help. There are those who are discouraged, those who are beset by poor health and challenges of life, which leave them in despair. I've always believed in the truth of the words, God's sweetest blessings always go by hands that serve him here below. President Monson had to work in a little rhyme there. Okay, that was his ammo. And then he continued and said, let us have ready hands, clean hands, and willing hands, that we may participate in providing what our Heavenly Father would have others receive from him. And I love that. We can see that that's what this little band of young soldiers did. Then Sister Sharon Eubank in April 2019 gave a talk called Christ, the Light That Shines in the Darkness. And she said, just a short little quote, she said, it's hard to get the lights back on by yourself. We need each other. We can help each other by showing up in person, recharging our spiritual batteries and repairing what went wrong where we can, right? And then finally, this is an old quote, but I really liked it. And I hope that as you listen to it, that you might think of, because if you're feeling inspired to say, okay, well, I want to show up for people. I want to show up and follow this example. This is Elder Marion D. Hanks from April 1980, a talk called Willing to Receive. And just see if any of these, if his words inspire within you anything specific way that you might be able to act and show up for like this army of Helaman did for Antipas, or like their fathers did for them. He said, the widowed and divorced suffer devastating displacement, also often alone and often in need of encouragement and help. Broken-hearted parents who have really tried, but whose progeny have chosen another path, are heartsick and often find little comfort in sermons or in the success of others. The numbers of single-parent families burgeon, each one representing special needs not understood by those who have not experienced them. We have the testimony of Scripture that the Lord God weeps when we do not choose him or truly love each other. The saddest circumstance any of us can envision, indeed the only evil that ultimately can really harm us, is in not choosing him and thus to be separated from him. But the companion tragedy, one that also brings suffering that makes him weep, is to fail in our affection for each other. Affection expressed in unselfish efforts to give the Christian service President Kimball referred to thrice this morning in 1980. Christian service to the hungry, the naked, the oppressed, those who are cast out, the widow, the orphan, the afflicted, the brokenhearted, the bruised, the abandoned, the elderly, the sick, and the imprisoned. And so that quote just kind of touched my heart, because it was a good reminder to me that sometimes I get stuck in my own little bubble of my own little problems. But as he listed all of these things, there are a lot of people who are tired and weary and need my encouragement, and I can show up and I can help. And just like those tired little running warriors turned around and helped, and they were strengthened by the Lord to serve, I can be strengthened in my own challenges too, when I reach out to help and encourage others. And so that was just a lesson that the Lord taught me this week in studying the chapters that we studied for Come Follow Me. So I don't know if either of you have any comments, but otherwise, Michelle, we can go ahead and move on to the how portion.
Perfect. Thank you. I just want to do my little highlight reel. I'm trying to, it's so hard when you have 11 chapters to not want to make this podcast 3 hours long. And I feel like, though, that's my struggle every week, is there's so many things in the scriptures that I want to talk about. So I've decided to do a little highlight reel so I can just quickly touch on a couple things that I really like, and then just share one thing that really stuck out to me in my study. So one of the things that really stuck out to me was in chapter 58, verses 6 and 7. And it says, the Lamanites were sallying forth against us from time to time, resolving by stratagem to destroy us. So here are the Nephites, they're hunkered down, but the Lamanites are still coming and attack, right? He says, nevertheless, we could not come to battle with them because of their retreats and their strongholds. And it came to pass that we did wait in these difficult circumstances for the space of many months. And that struck me because I think sometimes life just asks that we sit in some difficult waiting places. And I was just thinking, how do they function? How do they even get through that waiting place? And in verse 37, it says, it mattereth not, we trust God will deliver us, notwithstanding the weakness of our armies, and he will deliver us out of the hands of our enemies. So that was just one thing that struck me, was just the trust that we see the stripling warriors and Helaman and all those others that are fighting to preserve their religious freedoms and their families. They trusted in God. In fact, if you're looking at your paper scriptures, just the little column next over in 57:36, it says, now it came to pass that when I, Helaman, had heard these words, he says, I was filled with exceeding joy because the goodness of God in preserving us. And this was after a bloody battle where a lot of people that he probably knew were killed. And so it fascinates me that he can say that God is good. He can still see the goodness of God amongst the battle. So the other thing that made me think of is when I'm in my waiting place, when I'm in a difficult situation, am I able to be filled with joy because of the goodness of God? And then he finishes that verse out. He says that we might not all perish. Yea, I trust that the souls of them who have been slain have entered into the rest of their God. So I love the way that having gratitude and an eternal perspective can help us in our life. And that takes me to the one point that really stuck out to me. And it made me ask this question: what's my narrative? So, Heather, I wanted to ask you, could you tell us, because you've written more fiction than most people I know combined. I mean, how many novels have you written? And short stories? I don't know. I mean, just
Like 100 and something.
that's all.
Adds up. 20 years adds up.
Well,
So
when I
Heather
met
knows,
you in
Heather knows
2012,
something about writing fiction.
right?
Yes.
Just a little bit. When I met you in 2012, though, you had written like 5 or 6 novels at that time, right? So we're really
Probably, yeah.
talking just in the past 10 years.
Well, I think 2000, because my first book came out in 2004, and I felt like I was doing one book a year for several years, and then I started indie publishing. Probably around that time, around 2012 was when I started indie publishing too.
Yeah,
So
that's when we first met. And I was like, she's going to become my best friend. And
yes.
And in 10 years, I'm going to make a podcast.
We are. Anyway. So Heather, can you tell us what an unreliable narrator is?
So basically, so kind of is what it sounds, but an unreliable narrator is someone who is maybe in the throes of emotion. And so they're telling you what's going on in the story, but it might be exaggerating. It might be because they're very angry. They're not looking at both sides of what is possibly happening to them. It could also be that they don't know what's going on the other side. So they're just talking from just solely their point of view. And so if you're reading a book or reading a story that has an unreliable narrator, is you're only getting part of the story, is you're only getting a single point of view, and that single point of view might be very, very filtered.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think as a reader, it's either really fun to read an unreliable narrator because we know that they're unreliable because it's obvious to us what's going on.
Right.
Or sometimes it's just painful to read it. So this is actually touching back on kind of what you talked about, Heather, at the beginning in Alma 54. And that's where I'm going to spend some of my time, especially with Amaron. So you have Moroni, and I keep, ever since I was a teenager, I called him a moron. So Moroni and a moron, who I didn't know. Again, it's amazing how many things I don't catch, that he was a direct descendant of Zoram. Fascinating to me. So they're in the negotiations of these prisoners, right? And after going back and forth, Amaron was really, really mad. And again, as you insinuated, he goes back and he gives Moroni insight into why. So this is verse 16, 17, and 18. He says, I, Amaron, the king of the Lamanites, I am the brother of Amalickiah, whom ye have murdered. And I will avenge his blood upon you. Yea, I will come upon you with my armies, for I fear not your threatenings. For behold, your fathers did wrong their brethren, insomuch that they did rob them of their right to the government when it rightly belonged to them. And again, this is going back to like 2nd Nephi chapter 5, I think is the chapter where the Nephi split off from the Lamanites, which is funny because they didn't take anything. They split off. And so, I mean, basically they left Laman and Lemuel there to be their own kings. So no one was robbed. But that whole, the hundreds of year old false narrative, think of all the damage that was done because you have these unreliable narrators feeding generation after generation. And a lot of time, well, a false narrator, they don't know that they're wrong. Like you said, they have a singular perspective. And to them, it's very real and it's very right. So then I was like, oh my gosh, what false narratives might I have?
Right.
Because do you think Amaron, I think Amaron really thought that he was right. I mean, he was really mad about it. He wasn't like they said. He was like, we have been wronged all these years and you're going to pay. And so how do we know that we're not seeing through a glass darkly like Paul did? How do we know? And so I did some research and I was looking up and I found 5 ways, or I came up with five things that we can look and see if we're doing to see if we are our own unreliable narrators. So 1, if you find that there is excessive blaming of external circumstances, then you might be living a false narrative. You might be an unreliable narrator. So we call this the blame game in our house. Like if you come downstairs and your keys are missing, if your first response is who took my keys? Well, then, that's a knee-jerk reaction to blame an external circumstance. Number 2, constant negative talk or consistent negative talk. And so this is like, well, I don't know. What do you guys think negative talk is? Consistent negative talk. What would you consider that?
Well, I think to me, I automatically think of two things: negative self-talk, like when everything you're telling to yourself is negative, but also just, I mean, I fall into this trap sometimes where I'm like grouchy, and no matter what anybody says, I'm snippy about it. Like I can't, I fail to look for the good. And so I'm just always focusing on the negative, and then I get caught up in that. Yeah.
And suffering is really different than just being really cranky. I mean, I don't think I've ever heard a really cranky person say, wow, God is so good. This is awesome. Like, and mean it. But I've heard someone suffering through tears of anger or frustration or hurt say it and mean it. I don't know. What do you think, Heather?
I agree with both of you.
Yeah. She's never been cranky though, ever.
Well, no, I mean, yeah, definitely. But I do think that I will say something or do something or react or just view a person a certain way if my emotions are a little out of whack at that moment.
Yeah. And I love how you brought that up again, because so much of it is based on if you are making those, if your perspective is coming from a place of emotion. I was robbed, I was cheated, I was this, I was that. Another way to see if you are living under a false narrative is if you are and we're talking more extremes, not just a little bit here and there, but if you are holding on to grudges, if you are unwilling to be wrong, or if you are just holding on to negative views of yourselves and others. And sometimes we can live a false narrative, and it doesn't mean that we're bad people like Amaron. Sometimes when I look back at my past self, I don't look at my younger self in the best light, because I hold her to the same standard as I am now. And I'm not very patient with my past self. And I was going through a stage about 10 years ago where I was like, who even was I before my mission? I mean, and just kind of dismissive of younger Michelle. And I met this man. I was speaking at a women's conference, and he came up to me afterwards and he says, hi, do you remember me? And I do not remember him, because on top of everything else, on top of me making up my own narratives, I have a really terrible memory anyway. I don't, those people that write their autobiographies and like in 3rd grade, this is the conversation I had with Mrs. Drew. I cannot do that. I don't even remember I don't remember anything about my 7th grade year, but apparently I knew this guy because I was in the singles ward with him. I was teaching missionary prep class of which I don't remember. Again, really, really bad memory. What does that say about me? I don't know. And this sweet woman, and I have vague memories, this sweet woman came to church, and I had never met her. So I introduced myself to her, and she was there with her son. She was a single mom, and she was about to go home. And I said, don't go home. You should go to Sunday school. And she says, well, what do I do with him? And I said, I'll bring him. I'll bring him to my class. So I took her son to my class, and I guess I did this for like a month. And he taught mission prep, and she went to Sunday school. Well, her first day in Sunday school, she met this guy from the singles ward, and they ended up getting married. And so here I am going through this phase of, pre-mission Michelle. She was, I didn't think very highly of her. And yet he's like, you don't know how amazing you are and how your goodness and kindness blessed my life. And so when I was able to see myself through somebody else's eyes, a little bit of that glass got a little bit lighter instead of darker. And I think sometimes we don't mean to, but we live in these false narratives that allow ourselves to be angry and stay angry. But then you contrast this dark narrative with Helaman's narrative, where I just read, where he was filled with exceeding joy because of the goodness of God. So then the question is, how do we see through a clear glass? How do we get rid of that, the dark glass? And we get these answers in this reading block. We remember and we thank God, and we see his perspective. So in 55:31, the Nephites were not slow to remember their God. They remembered him. In 57:25, according to the great astonishment and joy of their whole army, not one soul did perish. So they had, again, just gotten through this whole huge bloody battle, and they still had joy, and they still recognized their blessings. We can also pray for discernment. I think that's a huge thing, is going to people and saying, help me, especially to the Lord, help me see myself and others and see you. And we talked about this a couple months ago about what humility is, right? Seeing each other and seeing God. I just love the fact that we are the narrators of our stories. And if we find ourselves really struggling and really feeling a lot of negative feelings, sometimes it is really challenging things that are happening to us. And we can't just snap our fingers and say, I want to be happy. But sometimes we can make adjustments to the narration that we're telling ourselves. President Russell Nelson said, he said, as we look at all things with eternal perspective, it will significantly lighten our load. So I just love the example of the perspective and the narrative of the Nephites and the stripling warriors, and what good examples they were. And we're going to see this again in these coming chapters too, because we're not quite done with the wars between the Nephites and the Lamanites yet. But I love the fact that we can go through really hard, challenging things, and we can have an eternal narrative. And that really gives us power to have gratitude, to be close to the Lord, and to make and keep those covenants and be blessed as we do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Heather. It's been great to kind of review what was going on in these kind of complicated war chapters, and then also to reflect on the principles that we can learn from that. And I'm grateful for the opportunity that I have had personally to study these chapters this week and think about how I can be better because of the great examples of these covenant-keeping warriors, literally, who were giving their all to fight for the cause of God and to protect their families and their children. And so grateful for that example. We hope that you have been inspired by something that you've heard today, that it will drive you back to your scriptures, and that this week you will deep dive into the messages and learn more from the powerful Book of Mormon. If there's anything in particular that you have enjoyed, please share it with those that you think might benefit from it. And we always welcome your likes, shares, and comments on any of our social media channels or podcast platforms. So thank you for joining us this week. Next week, we will continue the ongoing war saga among the Nephites and Lamanites, and we'll see you then. Goodbye, everyone.
See ya. Bye.